"I just need food and a place to sleep," he said. Then he saved her restaurant's busiest night. The rain had not stopped since noon, and by the time the stranger pushed through the door of Marion's table, the mud on his boots had turned the color of old rust, and his coat hung from his shoulders like something that had given up trying to keep him dry. Sarah Whitfield looked up from the stove only long enough to register that another body had entered her dining room, and then went back to stirring the beans, because there was no time in that kitchen for anything but stirring, plating, and praying the biscuits didn't burn. It was Founder's Day in Copper Hollow, the one evening of the year when half the county came into town for the fireworks and the dance at the Grange Hall, and every one of them, it seemed, had decided that Marion's table was where they would eat first. She had 6 tables full, 4 more waiting on the porch, 1 waitress down with a fever, and a cook, her only cook, her husband's old friend Walt, who had cut his hand open on a shattered plate an hour before and was now sitting in the back room with his palm wrapped in a dish towel, pale and useless, insisting he could still work and clearly unable to hold a knife. Sarah had inherited the restaurant 2 years ago, when the fever that took half the town in a single terrible month had also taken her husband Daniel, leaving her with a mortgage on the building, a 6-year-old daughter named Ruth, and a business she had never expected to run alone. She had made it work through sheer stubbornness, through nights so tired she fell asleep standing at the sink, through winters when the till barely covered the flour bill. Marion's table had been her husband's dream, named for his mother, and Sarah had decided the day after the funeral that she would rather work herself into the ground than let it close. Tonight, though, standing in a kitchen with a wounded cook, a missing waitress, and a dining room full of hungry, impatient townsfolk, she felt closer to the ground than she had in a long while. The stranger stood just inside the doorway, dripping onto the floorboards, looking around the crowded room like a man who understood immediately that he had walked into chaos. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who had spent years doing hard outdoor work, with several days of stubble on his jaw and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. He carried a canvas bag over one shoulder and nothing else. No horse tied outside that anyone had seen, no company. When Sarah finally came out from the kitchen to seat him, wiping her hands on her apron, he spoke before she could. "I don't have much money," he said, and there was no shame in the way he said it, only plain fact. "I can pay for a simple plate, whatever's cheapest, and I saw the sign for a room upstairs. I just need food and a place to sleep. I'll be gone by morning." Sarah had heard versions of that sentence before. Drifters passing through Copper Hollow on their way to somewhere else. Men who had lost their luck or their land or their families to the hard years that had settled over the territory. She didn't have the patience for it tonight. Not with Walt bleeding in the back room and Mrs. Odell at table 3 complaining loudly that she had been waiting 20 minutes for her coffee. "We're a bit short-handed," she said, more curt than she meant to be. "It'll be a wait." "I can see that," the stranger said, and something in his voice made her look at him properly for the first time. Not pity, and not the vague sympathy strangers sometimes offered when they saw a woman clearly overwhelmed. Something more practical than that. "Your cook's hurt bad?" He cut his hand. "He'll live, but he can't hold a spatula tonight, and I have no one else." The stranger set his canvas bag down against the wall, unhurried, the way a man does when he's already decided something. "I've cooked for 20 men at a time on a cattle drive for 6 years running," he said. "I'm not asking for pay beyond what you already offered. Give me an apron and tell me what's behind, and I'll get you through tonight." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't know this man's name, didn't know if he could be trusted around a hot stove or a cash box, didn't know anything about him except that he was wet and hungry and had walked in off the road at the worst possible hour. But Mrs. Odell was still complaining, and there was a ticket for 4 more plates sitting untouched on the pass, and Ruth was upstairs with Mrs. Calloway from next door because there had been no one else to watch her, and Sarah was so tired that the room had started to feel slightly unreal at the edges. She looked at the stranger's hands, broad, scarred across the knuckles, steady, and she made a decision she would spend the rest of the night questioning and, eventually, would spend the rest of her life grateful for. "There's an apron on the hook by the stove," she said. "If you burn my kitchen down, I'll have the sheriff on you before the smoke clears." "Fair enough," he said, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across his face before he turned and walked into her kitchen like a man walking into familiar territory. What followed was, in Sarah's memory afterward, something close to a miracle, though at the time it felt more like being swept up in a current too strong to fight. The stranger, who introduced himself simply as Cole while he tied on the apron, moved through her kitchen with an economy of motion that told her everything Walt's stories could not have. He found the stove's temperament within minutes, adjusted the damper without being told, and began working through the backlog of tickets with a calm efficiency that let Sarah breathe for what felt like the first time in an hour. He did not ask where things were kept more than once. He did not complain about the heat or the pace or the fact that half her spices were unlabeled because she had always known them by scent and habit. When a pot of gravy threatened to scorch, he caught it a half-second before disaster, whisking it off the heat with the kind of instinct that could not be taught in a single evening. Sarah found herself falling into rhythm with him without quite deciding to. She called out orders and he had them ready before she expected. She reached for a plate and he was already handing it to her. She turned to grab a towel and found he had already set one within reach. It was, she thought distantly while carrying out a tray of plates to table 5, like working alongside Daniel again, in the early years, before the restaurant had grown large enough to need more than the two of them. She had not felt that particular ease with another person in the kitchen since he died, and the feeling caught her off guard enough that she nearly dropped the tray. The dining room filled and emptied and filled again as the fireworks began outside, distant booms rattling the windows, and still Cole worked, unhurried but never slow, correcting the seasoning on a pot of beans with nothing but a taste and a pinch of salt, flipping flapjacks for a table of children who had wandered in soaked and cold with their parents. At one point Sarah caught him teaching Ruth, who had crept downstairs against Mrs. Calloway's instructions to see what all the commotion was, how to crack an egg one-handed, patient in a way that made something in Sarah's chest ache with a feeling she didn't have time to examine. Ruth had lost her father before she was old enough to properly remember him, and she had a way of watching men closely, cautiously, as though testing whether they might stay. She did not watch Cole that way. She watched him the way a child watches someone they have already decided to trust. By the time the last table had been cleared and the fireworks had faded to occasional distant pops, it was well past midnight, and Sarah stood in her own kitchen surveying the wreckage of the busiest night the restaurant had ever seen, dishes stacked but not yet washed, flour dusted across the work table, the good smell of wood smoke and gravy still hanging in the air, and felt something she had not expected to feel after a night like this. Not just relief, though there was plenty of that, but something closer to hope, thin and unfamiliar, like the first warmth of a fire just catching. "You saved this place tonight," she said, because it was true and because she did not know how else to say what she was feeling. "I don't know how to thank you properly." Cole was untying the apron, and in the lamplight she could see, now that the rush had settled, how tired he truly was, the kind of tiredness that went deeper than one long evening, the kind that came from months, maybe years, of a hard road. "You already did," he said. "Hot meal, dry roof. That's more than I've had in longer than I'd like to admit." She should have let it rest there. It was late, he was a stranger, and she had a daughter asleep upstairs and a business to protect and no business at all letting herself feel curious about a drifter who would, by his own word, be gone come morning. But the kitchen was quiet now, and there was something in the careful, guarded way he held himself, like a man who had trained himself not to expect kindness, that made her want to ask instead of simply accept his help and move on. "Where were you headed?" she asked, "before the rain and the food and my chaos got in the way?" Cole was quiet for a moment, folding the apron with more care than the task required. "Nowhere in particular," he admitted finally. "I worked a ranch 2 counties over for 4 years. Good work, steady. The owner passed this spring and his son sold off the herd and the land both, and I found myself with nowhere to be and no reason to be anywhere in particular. I've been walking since, taking work where I find it. Figured I'd land somewhere eventually." He looked around the kitchen, at the stove he had mastered in an hour, at the neat stacks of plates he had washed without being asked. "This is the first place in a long while that's felt like it might be worth stopping at." Sarah understood loss well enough to hear what sat underneath his words, not just the loss of work, but the particular unmooring that came from losing the place and the people that had given your days their shape. She knew what it was to wake up in a life that no longer resembled the one you had built, to have to decide, morning after morning, whether to keep going anyway. "I know something about starting over somewhere you didn't expect to be," she said quietly. "My husband died 2 years ago. Fever took him in 3 days. I had never run so much as a lemonade stand before that, and suddenly I had a restaurant, a mortgage, and a little girl who needed me to hold everything together whether I knew how or not." "You've done it though," Cole said, and there was no flattery in it, only observation. This place is full every night, from what I hear in town. People talk about Marion's table like it's the best kitchen for 30 miles. Some nights it feels like it's held together with string and stubbornness, she admitted, and found herself smiling. A real smile, the first one that had come easily and longer than she wanted to admit. Tonight especially. They talked longer than either of them likely intended, there in the quiet kitchen with the lamp burning low, about small things at first. The best way to keep a gravy from breaking, the strange quiet of a town after its one big night of the year, and then, gradually, about larger things. He told her about growing up the youngest of 6 on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri, about the years on cattle drives that had taught him to cook for a crowd and sleep under open sky, about the particular loneliness of a life spent always moving toward the next job rather than toward anything permanent. She told him about Daniel, about the dream of the restaurant they had built together in 3 short years before the fever came, about the fear that sat under everything she did now, the fear that she was not enough to keep the dream alive alone. Neither of them noticed the hour slipping later until the lamp had burned low enough that Sarah finally rose, startled, and said he ought to get some rest, that there was a room upstairs waiting and morning would come whether they were ready for it or not. He was gone from the room by the time she came down the next morning, though not gone from the building, as she had half feared and, she admitted to herself while lighting the stove, half feared for reasons that had nothing to do with needing his help in the kitchen. She found him instead already in the yard behind the restaurant, splitting wood for the stove with the same unhurried competence he had brought to everything the night before, a neat stack already growing beside the chopping block. He looked up when she came out, and there was something almost sheepish in his expression, as though he had been caught doing more than what was asked of him. Didn't want to leave without earning the room properly, he said, setting the axe down. Figured wood was something I could do without getting underfoot. You're welcome to stay for breakfast, Sarah said, and heard in her own voice something that was not merely politeness. Walt's hand is in no shape to work today either, if you're still willing. He looked at her for a long moment, the morning light catching the tiredness still in his eyes, but also something steadier underneath it, something that looked almost like a decision being made. I told you I'd be gone by morning, he said. Mornings have a way of changing a person's plans, Sarah answered, surprising herself with her own boldness. This one certainly changed mine. That was how it began, though neither of them could have said it plainly at the time, not as a grand declaration, but as one day becoming 2, and 2 becoming a week, Cole taking on more of the kitchen work while Walt's hand healed, splitting wood in the mornings before the restaurant opened, walking Ruth to the schoolhouse when Sarah's hands were full of dough and could not spare the time herself. The town noticed, as small towns do, the way the drifter who had wandered in during a storm had somehow become a fixture, the way Sarah's laugh had returned to her kitchen in a way it had not since before the fever, the way Ruth had taken to running to greet him each afternoon with the particular fierce devotion of a child who had decided, on her own terms and in her own time, that this man was someone worth loving. It was not without its difficulties. There were nights Cole grew quiet and distant, haunted by the particular restlessness of a man and used to staying anywhere long enough to be known, and morning Sarah caught herself pulling back, afraid of building something only to have it taken from her the way Daniel had been taken, afraid of what it would mean for Ruth to lose another father if things did not last. They were both, in their own ways, people who had learned caution the hard way. But caution, they discovered slowly, was not the same as certainty that things would go wrong, and by late autumn, when the leaves had turned and the harvest dance was approaching, Cole had stopped speaking of moving on entirely, and had instead begun speaking of the loose board on the porch step that needed fixing before winter, of the extra table he thought the dining room could fit if they rearranged the far corner, of the future in the unconscious, ordinary way people speak when they have quietly decided to stay. On the night of the harvest dance, with the restaurant closed for the evening and the whole town gathered at the Grange Hall, Cole found Sarah near the punch table, Ruth already asleep against Mrs. Calloway's shoulder in a chair by the wall, and asked her to step outside for a moment, out where the autumn air was cold and clear and full of stars. He did not have a speech prepared, he admitted, laughing a little at himself in a way she had rarely seen from him, a man usually so steady and unhurried suddenly looking almost nervous. I walked into your restaurant a stranger asking for nothing but a meal and a bed, he said. I've never in my life stayed anywhere longer than the work required. But I've been here 5 months now, and there isn't a morning I wake up wanting to be anywhere else. I'd like to stop being a man who's just passing through, Sarah. I'd like to be the man who stays. If you'll have me. Sarah, who had spent 2 years convincing herself that she needed no one, that she and Ruth would manage alone because that was simply what had happened to them and there was no changing it, found that the answer came to her without hesitation, the way true things often do once a person finally stops fighting them. Marion's table has always needed 2 people to run it properly, she said, her eyes bright in the starlight. I think it's time it had them again. They were married the following spring, a small ceremony in the churchyard with half the town in attendance, because by then everyone in Copper Hollow had watched the story unfold across a summer and autumn and knew there was nothing sudden about it at all, only 2 people who had found, in the unlikeliest of circumstances, exactly what each of them had stopped believing they would ever have again. Ruth stood between them at the front of the church, holding a hand of each, and Marion's table closed for the one and only day in its history that was not a holiday, because Sarah decided that some things mattered more than a full dining room, and the whole town understood well enough to forgive her for it. Years later, when travelers passing through Copper Hollow asked how the restaurant had come to have 2 names painted so lovingly above its door, Marion's table, and beneath it in smaller letters, EST by Daniel and Sarah, rebuilt by Sarah and Cole, the old-timers in town were always glad to tell the story of the storm-soaked stranger who had walked in one chaotic night saying he wanted nothing more than food and a place to sleep, and had ended up finding, instead, the very thing he had never let himself hope for: a home, a family, and a woman whose strength had matched his own from the very first night, long before either of them had understood what they were building together.